These are the sounds of the beach in Salento, at the southernmost tip of Italy. The blue water stretches to the horizon, and the waves strike a beautiful sandy beach. Just a few hundred meters away, past some centuries-old olive groves, lies a construction site where the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, or TAP, will emerge from the Adriatic Sea, bringing 10 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year from Azerbaijan. The pipeline has been hailed as an impressive feat of engineering that will help solve Europe's energy needs. But there's no overstating just how much the local population detests this development. How is the resistance by the local community and the consequent response of the authorities a microcosm of a larger global trend? My name is Sean Macheza, and you're listening to the State of Power podcast from the Transnational Institute, or TNI. TNI is an international research and advocacy institute committed to building a just, democratic, and sustainable planet. We're based in Amsterdam, and we believe there are alternatives to the world as it currently exists. We hope you believe this too. We use this podcast to share our research, explore alternatives to the status quo, and to give a platform to scholars and activists who are in the forefront of the fight against the current neoliberal world order. In this podcast, we use the case of the resistance against the TAP pipeline in Salento, Italy, to unpack how states, capitalist elites, and transnational corporations deal with protest and resistance against their activities, with a specific focus on the extractives industry. In order to better understand this phenomenon, TNI hosted a conference in Salento in late 2018 titled Policing Extractivism. This episode of the State of Power podcast will use material from the conference to understand the term pacification and how it relates to extractivism. Subsequent series will explore the concept in other fields, such as countering violent extremism, in the expansion of international borders, and in the general repression of individual and collective activism. The ultimate aim is to feed into the conversations about how movements, scholars, and activists across the globe can use the pacification framework to enhance their daily attempts to literally fight the power. Later in the podcast, we will hear from the foremost scholar in pacification theory. But first, Italy and the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline. Delegates began with a visit to the construction site. As local police watched from a distance, we heard how, despite massive local resistance, construction work on the pipeline began in earnest in March 2017 and currently still continues.
Per arrivare a una grande area industriale di 120.000 metri quadrati.
It will arrive in an industrial area, a very large industrial area of 120,000 square meters, which is 12 ettari, 24 acres or 12 hectares.
Quest'area lavorerà il gas con degli impatti su tutte le popolazioni che abitano intorno.
Oh, here the gas will be treated with an impact on all the surrounding populations.
Per avere un'idea, intorno a quest'area, in 3,5 km ci sono 20.000 persone.
To give you an idea, around the area,
lì pure a 100 metri ci sono le case.
Sì.
yeah, oh, the houses are 100 meters away and 20,000 people living in the surrounding area.
And, quite obviously,
they didn't manage to get the approval or to get the consent of the population.
This is because, in addition to the eyesore that is the construction site, and the damage not only to the beach but also to centuries-old olive groves, the construction of the pipeline will need at least 90 cubic meters, that is 90,000 liters of water per day. And this will obviously wreak havoc on the water table. So there's an ongoing push by local activists to stop the continued development of the site.
Was all peaceful demonstration, but very, very resolute, I say. Yeah.
Qualcuno è riuscito a farsi ferire, giusto Silvano? Con un 4-5 punti in testa.
Well, with all this, somebody got hurt, you know.
He got hurt.
He got hurt.
The one who got hurt is a man I only got to know as Silvano. He and his son run the local bar.
We meet here.
Bar del Movimento.
In Bar Roma.
Bar Roma.
Bar Roma.
Bar del Movimento NoTap. Resistant bar.
It's the resistance bar.
Okay.
I heard Silvano's story, and the short summary is that during one of the demonstrations against the construction site, he tried to save a woman because a segment of the wall was about to fall on her. But when he went in to help, 2 policemen attacked him with their truncheons, and eventually he needed 5 stitches on his scalp, which he showed me, in addition to other injuries. Since the officers didn't wear any name tags, his attempted litigation failed, as he couldn't identify his assailants. Silvano lived to tell me his story, but the same is not true for all those who stand up in defense of their local environment and against the activities of corporations. While the problems may be similar, the methods of pacification tend to reflect the political and economic realities of where they occur. Maria del Carmen Verdu is a lawyer and activist with Corepi, an organization that is against police and institutional repression in Argentina. I caught up with her at the sidelines of the conference, and she had a story to share.
In my country, we are basically producers of primary goods, and in the last 20 years, we have been forced to a monoculture industry with soybeans, and that means the destruction of the soil. It also means the pollution of air and water with the use of pesticides and fertilizers, with chemical agents that attack the immune and hormonal system of people. And many who have opposed this policy have been repressed and criminalized. And in that struggle, we have not only criminalized comrades, but also assassinated fellows such as Rafael Nahuel, who was a Mapuche 21-year-old shot in the back, or Santiago Maldonado, who was disappeared and later killed in the repression of their resistance. Mapuche communities have been fighting for their ancestral lands for decades on end. There is a small group settled in a region very near the city of Esquel in Chubut. It's called Pulof Cuyamen in Resistencia. And in January 2017, they were heavily repressed by federal forces. We were there with Nora Cortiñas, one of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, and other human rights and anti-repressive organizations to request the freedom of those who were taken prisoners. And later on in the year, on July the 30th, 7 Mapuche members of the community and Santiago, who was not Mapuche, but he was there in solidarity, cut off a federal route, Route 40. They were attacked by Gendarmeria, which is another federal force. These gendarmes went into the Mapuche territory, and Santiago disappeared. He was last seen near the Rio Chubut, Chubut River, when he was escaping from gendarmes. And for 67 days, we didn't know anything about his whereabouts until his dead body was found in a place that had already been tracked and searched 4 times in those 67 days, and, which is more interesting, 300 meters upstream, which allows us to presume that the body was planted there after his death. The disappearance of Santiago produced enormous mobilizations of over 2 million people in the city of Buenos Aires and in the rest of the country. and it allowed to break the media siege on the Mapuche situation.
Has anyone been held to account for Santiago's experience?
No, in fact, the Minister of Security, Patricia Bullrich, immediately said that she would not throw any gendarme through the window. And 2 months later, in another Mapuche community in Lake Mascardi, very near Bariloche, which is a very well-known ski resort, a 21-year-old Mapuche boy, Rafael Nahuel, was shot in the back by Prefectura while he was escaping from a raid against his community, and the national government stated that the version of the forces was the true version, the only true version, and as they said, they had been attacked, so it was just a detail that the bullet had entered his body through the back.
You're listening to the State of Power podcast from the Transnational Institute, TNI. Today, we're talking about the pacification of resistance, with particular reference to extractivism. So how can we understand pacification in a deeper sense? I decided the best place to start was to talk to the foremost authority on pacification, who will work closely with TNI to develop the concept a little further. His list of publications includes books with titles like A Critique of Security, another one called Anti-Security, and another book called War Power, Police Power. He is also a member of the editorial collective for the journal Radical Philosophy.
So my name is Mark Nell-Klaus, and I am the Professor of the Critique of Political Economy at Brunel University, UK.
Thank you so much for speaking with me, Mark. So you originated the concept of pacification? Is that accurate?
No. The concept of pacification has a very long history. What I did several years ago is, in my research on security, I discovered more and more documents about pacification, and so I got interested in the history of the concept of pacification, and I've been exploring how we might use it to understand modes of power in the contemporary world.
What would you say is the most important element of the theory as it relates to the extractives industry, which is the theme of this conference?
Well, for that we'd have to go back into some of the history. It has a long history of the state engaged in reproducing social orders, and in particular producing capitalist orders, and in particular using a range of tools to produce capitalist orders, some of which are very explicitly violent, but others are less violent and more, if you like, consensual. In other words, they involve winning the hearts and minds of the people. So one of the interesting things about struggles in the contemporary world is that a lot of the struggles that are taking place now are struggles over extraction. They're struggles over oil, gas, energy supplies, pipes in order to transport energy supplies. And so what is happening is that there's, many people across the world are being mobilized against this because local communities are being destroyed, territories are being reclaimed, and lives are being decimated. And so a lot of people are now being mobilized against extractive industries. So what's interesting is to think about how the state is trying to pacify the people in order to make sure that the extraction takes place. That pacification has different forms which kind of replicate the history of the idea. So sometimes it's straightforwardly violent. People are being beaten and disappeared, killed. And other times it's much more subtle.
In Melendugno, we were actually videotaped by the police. How would you define the role of the police in this pacification process?
We've been trying to use the concept of police to understand actual police forces, i.e. the institutions that everyone describes as the police, but we're also trying to use the concept of police to understand broader forms of social policy, broader forms of state powers, which fabricate the people, fabricate the market, construct a social order organised around accumulation. So, in that sense, the history of pacification is in part the history of police forces involved in constructing the social order. What you see with protests against extraction is the police in very brute form, right, directly in front of you, uniformed, armed, and of course they're there on a permanent basis. Unsurprisingly, they're there in order to sometimes carry out acts of violence against the people, but sometimes their power is expressed in far more subtle ways. So, for example, when you went to the site and you were being filmed and you realised you were being filmed by the police, you probably felt a little bit uneasy.
It did alter our behaviour.
Exactly, and it alters your behaviour on the day. And of course, you can't get it out of your mind because you're wondering what they're going to do with the videos and when they're going to start trying to match your face up to the records that they might hold or international police forces might hold and so forth. And of course, that's a far more subtle way of trying to stop people protesting against the extraction industries.
How do you link pacification with poverty?
Well, again, the whole history of pacification is a history in which the class of poverty, which is the labouring class, i.e. the working class, or some political traditions are called the proletariat, it's about how that population has been policed. Essentially, if the state is going to fabricate a social order organised around capitalist accumulation, it has to produce the working class over and over again. Again, sometimes that consists of acts of obvious, overt, explicit violence, and other times it consists of acts which are far more subtle, but which nonetheless fabricate wage labour. This is one of the reasons why we like to use the concept of police in a very broad way when we're thinking about pacification, because it asks us to consider how, for example, a welfare system or a tax system is used to construct or fabricate wage labour. We're working with the idea that, with the concept of poverty, which is defined as the absence of any form of subsistence other than the wage. In other words, it's poverty where people are forced to go out to work because they have no other means of living.
Somehow find your role in the system.
And this is a classic definition of poverty as used in the early days of political economy and also the early days of police science. In other words, it was very explicit in police science history that the key target of policing, of all forms of policing, is the poor.
Is there something the citizen and social movements that may be listening can do about it?
What we're trying to do with this concept is really deeply connect pacification to the process of capital. We have to understand that capitalism always involves pacification. It always involves exercises of power to create forms of accumulation, new forms of accumulation to reproduce the working class time and again. As long as you have capitalism, you have pacification. They go hand in hand. So the question, what can we do about pacification, is in a sense the question, what do we do about capitalism? And that, of course, is a big question that was never going to be answered at this conference. Of course, individually and in smaller groups, we can campaign and struggle against the forms of pacification that are being imposed on us at various points. And what you see with the NoTap movement is precisely that. People being mobilised against measures which are designed to create a better life for capital, and is in the process destroying their lives.
My conversation with Mark shows that what we're seeing unfolding in Salento is a specific manifestation of pacification. But pacification occurs in various other overt and subtle means. What cannot be mistaken is the commonality in the individual and collective struggles to protect our environmental commons.
We are sharing the same problems against oppression, against repression, against exploitation all over the world, and that from different angles, from us as activists or others as academics or just citizens of the places where these sort of enterprises are going on, like here in Salerno, we have a common interest. And that common interest is that of the working class, which necessarily must prevail, but to do so, it has to unite and fight together.
You're listening to the State of Power podcast from the Transnational Institute. Thank you so much for listening this far. TNI's material is all free, but we would greatly appreciate your help to keep doing the work we do. If you would like to find out more about TNI's work, please look us up at www.tni.org and find us on social media at TN Institute on Twitter and Transnational Institute on Instagram and Facebook. Here's what else you can find in the conference recordings.
I'm not an academic, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an activist. And what I want to do with my talk today is to talk specifically about some of the practical lessons that activists in Italy and elsewhere may be able to draw.
And in doing so, I've focused a lot on the representation of Palestine, Israel, as a key laboratory or node of global violence.
Emergence of critical infrastructure resilience as a national security strategy.
CORREPI, the organization I belong to, has registered more than 200 forced disappearances since the end of the last dictatorship in December 1980.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we do with the Gastivist Network, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the types of repression and state violence that is experienced within the network that is fighting gas around the world.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Transnational Institute's War and Pacification Program, where it came from.
It was difficult to get the name.
Okay. But this doesn't stop you from continuing with the protest?
No.
And your bar is still the resistance bar. Sempre, resistant a oltranza. Sempre. Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.